Corporal del Boggs drove like a man who had once outrun dust devils on dirt tracks. His hands never trembled on the wheel. They were called oddities at first. Doctrine favored a measured advance, the Sherman in support, infantry leading, and tanks in prepared positions. Losses were accepted as part of the gamble. If a division survived and ground was taken, higher command counted that as success. Poole, who had read the maps and watched the graves, counted differently. He measured lives in degrees of exposure, in the time an enemy needed to find a range and bring an 88 to bear. Poole's calculus was simple and brutal in its pragmatism. If he could shave seconds off the enemy's decision, he could save men. The first demonstration did not occur in the fanfare of high command. It happened on a small lane outside Saint-Lô when a panther crept into a hedgerow pocket and found a Sherman where it did not expect one. The panther's frontal plate was thick and threatening at distance. Standard engagement doctrine urged caution. Poole had no intention of trading his men's lives on a long exchange. He ordered Boggs to breach the hedge at 20 degrees faster than usual, not waiting for an artillery brigade to soften the ground. Close fired, the loader's hand snapping the shell into the breech like a practiced pistol shot. Willis, steady, settled the crosshair and let the barrel climb as the Sherman breathed forward. It was quick. The panther had a moment of surprise and then of confusion when the Sherman moved too fast for its crew to pivot. Poole's aim was not to win a gun duel across a field, but to reorganize the geometry of battle, flank the predator, make the heavy armor irrelevant. The panther's gun missed its pacing. The Sherman's shell found the flank. The explosive arc was hard and clinical. The panther burned, its crew's fate left respectful and unelaborated. The lane smelled of char and pressed earth. The rest of the column blinked at how a tank they'd been told to fear had been felled by speed and nerve. That small victory became a textbook in miniature for Poole. He kept notes in his head, distances where Sherman shot could be decisive, angles where the panther's belly was vulnerable, the number of seconds a loader needed when the rounds were prearranged on a standard sequence. He catalogued the Sherman's advantages: a gun that could punch with proper placement, a suspension and powertrain that could take the jolts and eat hedgerows if handled right, and its liabilities: thinner frontal plating, volatile fuel stowing, and a turret traverse that was no match for a disciplined German crew's first shot at range. Poole's crews began to run repetitions. Before dawn, the men practiced exits and entries, the way close would pass rounds and secure spent casings so nothing snagged in the bustle. They practiced the 6-second reload, the heartbeat of Poole's system. Shell out, hand over, ram, close, check, fire.
Guia de estilo e instruções para a síntese de fala. Você é narrador, palestrante, com voz potente, forte e autoritária. O tom deve ser firme e inabalável. Contexto de continuidade. A frase anterior era: shell out, hand over, ram, close, check, fire. Você está no meio de uma frase ou pensamento. Mantenha o ritmo e a força vocal sem quebrar a conexão. Haja como se estivesse transmitindo uma verdade fundamental. If they could average less than 7 seconds under fire, Poole reasoned, they could create windows of lethal opportunity before enemy crews completed their aim. Without a radio to rely on, they developed a lexicon of small signs. A fingertip on the left periscope meant ready to move. A shift of the commander's shoulder meant flank now. The broken radio had become a teacher of muscle memory. When Poole's platoon found itself in a row of engagements across July and into August, these rehearsed motions translated into survivability and scores. Micro scenes of combat read like hunts. A village approach where a stucco wall hid a stug. A sunken lane that allowed a panther to count crosshairs. A barnyard where armor-piercing rounds clattered in. Poole's tactic in each case remained consistent. He would make a feint from one angle, drawing the enemy's return to measure response time. Then, before the German gun could adjust, Poole would twist his Sherman outward, riding the suspension hard, and slap a shell into the vulnerable flank. The speed of movement disoriented crews trained to methodical action. The Sherman's frontal vulnerabilities were neutralized when it struck where the tank was not expected. These field lessons came with cost. Men who had argued for doctrine's steadiness were collected into casualty lists. Names, ranks, dates, the sterile language of headquarters. Captains and lieutenants who had followed the time-honored approach found themselves in the soil or in hospitals with burns and broken bones. Poole saw that in numbers and in the way close friends stopped joining in light talk after an engagement. He watched Willis for a week after a firefight, and the gunner's laugh thinned. The men did not trade tales of gore among themselves. They noted absences and polished shells until even the metal looked contrite. Poole's reputation grew in the gaze of those who saw him fight. To support units, he became a force multiplier. A company whose presence meant a hedgerow would not deny progress. A village axis would yield. His kill list, a number he never seemed eager to recite, was an argument made of losses inflicted and lives spared within his own command. Higher headquarters took notice and grumbled about recklessness, even while officers on the ground sent for him to lead when things had to cut through. The mechanics of Poole's approach were as precise as a clock. He taught his crew to use the Sherman's mobility. A Sherman M4 could push at about 24 to 30 miles per hour on road and make tight turns in hedgerow breaches that heavier armor could not manage without losing momentum. He emphasized distances. Within 200 yards, the Sherman could make good hits on flanks and weak spots. Beyond that, the German guns had the advantage. He drilled reloads until they resembled breathing. He set rules of engagement that seemed blunt to some. Never stop once the decision to attack had been made, and never allow the enemy to center a shot comfortably.
Training spilled into improvisation. Once, in a French farm lane choked with fog and the smell of manure, Poole had the crew lay down the string of spent machine gun belts in a pattern. When a German commander sent a reconnaissance tank that afternoon, it cited the belts as signs of a prepared ambush and altered its route. But Poole used that alteration to herd the enemy into a field where the Sherman could approach through a shallow depression. Tactical misdirection, the kind learned from hunting rabbits and circling coyotes, became a regular tool. The Sherman, called Ronson's or Tommy Cooker by some, acquired a reputation that mixed affection with dread. A powerful hunter, yes, but a dangerous box if handled poorly. Poole's men learned rituals. Before a push, Close would wipe his hands on a rag and place the next shell precisely where his fingers could find it in the dark. Richards would run his thumb along the seam of the bow hatch and whisper something that could be a name or a prayer, no one asked. Boggs would check the tracks, not just for mud, but for a rhythm in the links, listening for a skip that meant a brittle plate. Willis would murmur the range and a correction, and Poole would nod once, the single motion that let them move as one. Not all of Poole's choices were celebrated. In command rooms where maps hung and coffee cooled, colonels debated whether his speed-led methods invited unnecessary risks. An artillery officer once called his approach audacious to the point of being unmethodical. Poole understood the criticism, but answered it with results. Hedgerows taken without infantry columns dissected. Enemy armor neutralized before it could coordinate. Fewer wounded among units that fought along his axis. The moral calculus for Poole pivoted on a single axis. Fewer of his men dead meant fewer families broken. Doctrine could be patient about acceptable losses. He could not. As summer edged toward August, Poole's tactics matured into a doctrine of their own within his platoon. He taught flanking angles that forced German armor to expose side skirts and transmission casings. He calibrated fire control inputs so that the Sherman's shots found thicker steel behind the tracks. He refined timing so the first two shots were meant not to destroy, but to disorient. The third was often the lethal one, placed with the kind of quiet accuracy that made the tank feel less like a machine and more like a hand. The German response evolved too. Crews learned to bait and stall, to set anti-tank guns on reverse slopes, to use infantry with Panzerfausts in the hedgerow shadows. Poole adapted. He began sending his tanks in pairs for certain missions, each covering the other's blind spots. He used staggered approaches to split attention, and built contingency signals when the radio remained unreliable.
The broken radio, which had been an annoyance, now counted as a hidden advantage. Without it, their moves could not be intercepted over the ether. The tank's motions were a closed secret among 5 men and a commander. In late August, following a sequence of engagements that stripped the German formations of cohesion, Poole's platoon found itself asked to support a larger push toward a rail junction. Between stretches of orchard and scarred fields, they encountered a belt of enemy tanks dug with infantry support, a classic knight's gambit that could stall an entire division. Poole's reconnaissance found gaps in their deployment, a margin for speed. He briefed his crew with the efficiency of a man who had taught in storms. "We go close," he said, and the sentence was not a boast, but an instruction. Boggs would drive, Willis would settle, Close would feed, Richards would watch the outside. The 6-second rule would be the metronome. Poole used a rattlesnake image only once in that briefing, fingers drawing on the map the arc of a strike. He said simply, "We make 'em strike where they can't hurt us." They moved like a hunting pack. The first contact was abrupt. Tracer slashed, a German round nicked the turret ring and sent soot into the air. The Sherman answered with a suppressed pop of its own, the shell smoothing along metal and burying itself where armor was emissive. Then another shot, then the clatter of an engine that had had its lifeblood taken. The sequence was not cinematic in the way newsreels made heroism look. It was math, timing, heat, and cold decisions. When it was over, the rail junction was threatened and the German belt was fractured. Poole's platoon had taken casualties, a driver with a collapsed rib case, a loader with a shoulder bruise. But the unit on the flank had been spared by a mile of chain reaction that sent enemy forces reeling. The praise that came afterward was cautious and measured. Reporters in Paris would later write of Poole as a brilliant tactician. For the men who served under him, the memory was simpler. The man who taught them to breathe in the face of steel, to move as if every motion were a sentence written in a tight hand. Yet Poole himself never lost sight of the ledger. He kept the broken radio's lesson foremost. Command is not only speech, it is preparation. War will take what it wishes. A commander can only buy time and tilt it toward survival. By September, the tempo of operations had become a test of muscle memory against attrition. Poole's methods had been copied in pockets across divisions. His name flowed through dispatches as one who could be relied upon to make a lane where none seemed possible. The hunting metaphor stayed with him, returning in small private ways. A farmer's eye for the lay of ground, a rattlesnake's danger respected and neutralized. But the cost had grown visible in faces that would not laugh easily anymore. The war was still a business of inches and choices.
In one skirmish in early September, Poole's tank squadron drove into an orchard where German infantry with shaped charges waited in dung-streaked foxholes. Poole's instincts told him to swing wide, but he also knew the price of hesitation. He ordered the maneuver that had become second nature: flank, close, and feed the rhythm of shells. The orchard filled with smoke and the metallic rasp of spent casings. A Panzerfaust arced from a fold in the hedgerow and struck with a consummate clinical force. The Sherman burned, and the crew was forced to abandon the vehicle. The incident, like others, was described then in operational language: a loss, a costly exposure. But for the men who climbed out of the tank, the moments afterward were a private ledger of who had lived and how they would carry it. Poole survived engagements like these by calculation and by luck. He kept a mental map of probabilities: where German ambushes most often lay, how long shells took to cook through a turret ring, when infantry was likely to conceal anti-tank weapons. He balanced aggression with a tempered humility that his crews saw in the way he checked their faces before orders. He had become a living repository of the doctrine he had improvised from failure, and that doctrine would soon be tested in a way he had not rehearsed. The campaign moved from hedgerows to open fields, from the broken churches of Normandy to the shell-scabbed roads of northern Europe. Poole's methods traveled with him like an invisible tool set. He was praised, studied, and sent where commanders needed someone who did not accept attrition as inevitable. But a campaign is a long machine, and even the best-driven axle can shear. The broken radio had taught him to trust rehearsal. It had not taught him how thin the line between daring and fate could be when the other side learned to set its own traps. The summer's string of successes had made men confident and commanders expectant. In the next days, when movement converged into a larger collision with German reserves, Poole would find himself facing a danger different from hedgerow ambushes: a deliberate, patient counter that tested reflexes and the very assumption that speed could always win. He tightened his jaw and checked the turret, hands moving across familiar metal. The broken radio lay under a rag on the floor, repaired enough to listen, but still a reminder that the best signals were those the crew could send without speaking. They would need every one of them. They came at dawn, not all at once, but like a pressure that built beneath the skin of the earth. Recon reported columns of gray moving along the secondary roads beyond the ridge, bicycles and trucks, figures in the half-light folding into armored cars, and once the light strengthened, the low, terrible silhouette of panthers easing through orchard gaps. The movement was patient. It was not the desperate, chaotic lunge of a routed force, but the confident, rhythmical advance of a reserve brought to bear. Where Poole had expected speed and shock, he now faced a curriculum of patience. The Germans could wait, prepare killing zones, and let momentum do the work it had long been taught to do. Poole gathered his lieutenants beneath the collapsed roof of a farmhouse that still smelled of old wheat and oil. A map lay across a splintered table, pencil marks rubbed gray by a thumb that had learned to erase mistakes cleanly. Men filtered in and out of the room, drivers with dark grease along their forearms, radio operators with patched earpieces, a medic who kept his eyes on the door as if expecting a wound to arrive with the messenger. Poole did not speak at first. He listened. The rust of movement outside, the hushed exchanges, the brittle whisper of a wind that tended hedges dry, these were his current intelligence. "Reserve coming from north," said Carver, his voice dry as lint. "3rd Panzer elements. They've set points along the lane. Mines are up by the mill. Recon patrols saw wire at the creek." Poole let the information sit. In his head, the probabilities moved like beads on wires. The likely range of artillery support. The timing of an armored spearhead through the fields. Where infantry would try to fix his tanks, and where the anti-tank teams would lie in wait. He traced a line with his pen. Draw them by the causeway, force them into the shell of the village, make the hedgerows work for us. The idea was less a plan than a set of traffic rules. The execution would be all friction and grit. "We can't stand open," he said. "If they bring Panthers in the open, they own the day. We will shape the ground. You'll send 2 squads east to the orchards with anti-tank rifles and a couple of tank hunters on foot. Carver, you take Bravo's flank and dig the lane with false signs. Let them believe it's easy. Let our lanes be traps." A man laughed once under his breath, half humor, half disbelief. "Traps against Panthers, sir." "You take what you can build," Poole answered. "You don't fight everything with a cannon. You force decisions. Make them choose where to expose their armor." Orders drifted out. Men dispersed with the practiced motions of soldiers who had learned to translate a spoken sentence into 1,000 small tasks. Poole watched them go and felt the ledger add another column. Lives to put on hold. Risks to be nursed like a lit coal. The broken radio lay on the table. Someone had draped a rag over the receiver, as if that could quiet the memory of static. Poole rubbed the pad of his thumb across a dark line on the map and thought of rehearsal. He had rehearsed this kind of contingency. Lessons drawn in muddy tear stains and blood that would not stop being pedagogical. But rehearsal could not account for a commander's infirmity, the enemy that chose to think differently.
The first hits came 2 days later, and the weather announced them as if nature were a conspirator. Rain turned the brown lanes into ribbons of oil. Visibility went soft and uncertain. The Germans crawled forward in the wet, their tracks leaving black scars. Poole's forward screens reported contact at the creek. Rifle fire, then an explosion that raised a geyser of mud where a scout car had been. A Panther's gun flashed in the gray at longer range, smaller than a sun, then muted by rain. Poole positioned his tanks in a staggered line behind the hedges, not because a hedge could stop a shell, but because it forced the enemy to commit.
The Sherman's armor was a doctrine of angles and probability. It could be beaten, certainly, but its effectiveness lived in how it was used. Poole's tankers had wired tree branches on the tops of turrets, hung old rags to break up silhouettes, and set up dummy tanks of crates and canvas where the road bent. Cheap gestures that had cost lives in other places, but might, in some cases, buy the width of a breath. They baited the first rip of the German advance with smoke and sound. The dummy tanks drew shells, 2 at first, then a third that left a crater and no panther. When the enemy realized it was deception, they slowed, tightened their formations, and fed radio chatter into the rain. Poole's ears did not need to hear German to understand what was being said by the sequence of fire. Mine layers dulled the lane. Artillery found points to pin them down. It felt as if an invisible hand had folded the battlefield inward. The trick worked until it did not. An anti-tank team, well led and patient, squinted from the fold of a hedgerow and scored a shot that ruined the barrel of one of Poole's Shermans. The crew climbed out with the practiced efficiency of men trained to survive, faces as blank with shock as a face can be. The medic, a wiry man called Haynes, busied himself with a dressing as if stitches could sew back the day. Losses began to graze the edges of the platoon, minor but accumulating. Worse was the patient counter that the reserves had learned to practice, a series of small tests, probing actions that cost less in men than knowledge. Patrols would dart, drawing fire. An artillery salvo would test a hedgerow for a weakness. A small sweep of infantry paired with a heavy gun would attempt to seize a crossroads. Each test did not aim to break Poole in a single arc, but to gather the ledger of his responses. The Germans were asking questions and, when he answered, cataloging the pattern. At night, Poole walked the positions, helmet damp with rain, his breath like a small furnace in the air. Men huddled in foxholes with cigarettes that glowed with a private light. One of Poole's crewmen hummed tunelessly as he replaced a track section, the noise of the tune thin as cord. Poole kept his talk short. It was better to be plain when things tightened. He listened to reports, tapped at his map, and then, sometimes, simply sat to watch the sky clear into an indifferent cathedral of stars. "You ever think it ends?" whispered one of the drivers, a young man with cheeks still soft from home. "All wars end," Poole said. "Not all of them end for the same man." That night there was a new variable. Intelligence brought in a rumor, true or not, of a German counter that favored a pincer. While the main arm rebuilt itself for an armored surge, a company of Panzer Grenadiers would attempt a night push through the broken farmsteads to the south, a flanking move designed to collapse the hedgerow defenses from within. If the rumor held, Poole was about to be squeezed between two hands that did not always coordinate nicely. He rearranged the chess pieces. He placed his most experienced crews where the hedges opened to broader fields, and kept a reserve tucked in the lee of a ruined monastery, engines idling, smell of oil and old dust in the air. He sent out men with white thread tied to boots as a crude way to mark lanes in the dark. That night, the invisible threads of decisions were as important as steel. Poole's tactic always was to distort the enemy's perspective, make them think the most probable line of attack was one thing while you prepared for another. The night attack, when it came, had the surreal quality of being both loud and almost intimate. The grenadiers moved like something half-masked by the dark, voices low, rifles clipped to chests. The hedgerows shuddered with their movement, and for a moment Poole felt the old hunting rhythm return. The quiet focus, the narrowing of distance between predator and prey. Except he was neither predator nor prey in the old sense. He was a man attempting to pay for time with other people's courage. The first engagement was brutal, not because of volume, but because of proximity. Men found themselves shoulders to shoulders with men from the opposite color, exchanging fire that sounded too close to be real. Hand grenades arced, hot and mean, landing in the soft earth. One hedgerow became a crucible. Poole's men fought to hold it, and in the struggle the night acquired a texture of breath and swore names. Poole himself was on the flank, hands on a radio that seemed to pick up little but the thrum of static and the breathing of the night. He barked orders, felt them become action. A squad moved, an MG nest was suppressed. A Panzerfaust team was pushed back by unequal but fair violence. But the enemy's patience reasserted itself. A Panther found a small unannounced lane and fired with a calmness that made Poole's surety wobble. A tank crew, his best, took a hit that rolled them back in a muffled fury. The hedgerow was saved, but the cost was set like a stamp in a book. By dawn, the world looked as if someone had dragged a great gray broom across it. Men were hunched, mud on their boots like a permanent ink.
There were cries when returns were counted. Men who had been whole the night before were now honored in ways the living did not accept. Poole walked among them with the ledger on his tongue, and he found pockets of anger that had nothing to do with ideology, the bitterness of having given a man to an arithmetic of survival and found the sum wanting. The German patient counter had been partially blunted, but the reprieve was small because the enemy still had reserves and because the weather had become an ingredient in the recipe of war. Poole knew the larger collision would not be measured only by tanks and guns. It would be decided along the line where a commander could make men see a possibility and grant them the will to act on it. He had a plan to force such a moment, to wedge himself into a narrow corridor and then, at the right instant, open it like a hinge for his own reserves to pass. It was a move that required timing, concealment, and a measure of look that a man gets when his calculation aligns with an enemy misstep. It would, if successful, buy a lane out of a tightening vice. The preparations were meticulous. Poole's men stripped the fields of anything that could make sound, cooking pots, loose boards. They built makeshift berms that suggested emplacements, hung blackened cloth to simulate spent wreckage. They rehearsed withdrawal routes until the map in their heads fit the tracks underfoot. Carver, who had been with Poole through some of the harder days, organized the timing. "We break at 10, he said. "We move like we mean it. You get your reserve through, I'll cover the throat." "And if it's not enough?" asked a young lieutenant, eyes hollow. "Then we make them pay for every inch," Poole said. He did not like speeches. He liked to fix the line of probability with a look and a gesture and then nudge events in the world to match that probability. The morning of the operation was thin with light, and Poole felt the old hunter's patience as a tangible thing. Men were already in position. Their breath looped white in the crisp air. The broken radio sat where he had placed it, its receiver humming a small, persistent distress. He fingered the ragged fabric and thought of all the times he had learned to trust the wordless signals his crews used.
An eyebrow, a hand against a turret, the simple click of a safety off. Those were the messages that mattered most. At the appointed hour, they moved. The sheltering smoke fed the movement, and Poole's reserve slipped through a lane made to look like retreat. The idea was to make the enemy commit to occupying ground that would encourage them to overstretch. For a moment, the plan breathed as intended. Shells fell behind them, and German troops advanced into the apparent vacancy. Poole felt the first sharp pleasure of success, thin as a coin. Then, as these moments often do, the world introduced a new fact.
The ridge, when they reached it, afforded them the brief view of victory. A line of German movement that could be harassed, a position from which to menace supply lines and force a recalculation in enemy headquarters. Poole stood atop the ridge, helmet mud-smeared, and watched his men move to secure the height. He thought of the broken radio under the rag in his tank, the thing that had taught him the economy of preparation, and felt an odd gratitude that the rag was still there. It marked a line between voice and silence. Yet gratitude in war is brittle. He knew there would be counterattacks. He knew losses would be counted, and that the ledger would always be imprecise. But for the moment, they had forced the German reserve to show some of its hand, and that revelation was a currency wars accepted. As dusk began to stain the sky with the gray of cooling fire, Poole allowed himself a rare, private assessment. Men were tired to a bone he could feel in his palms. The wounded were being ferried to makeshift litters. The dead were wrapped in whatever fabric could be spared, faces turned away as if to put some dignity between the man and the earth. Smoke rose in slender pillars where tanks gave their last breath. Out beyond, the enemy still brewed, not vanquished, but tempered by an operation that had cost them as well. Poole gave orders for consolidation. He left others in command of the immediate defense and walked down the ridge alone for a time, letting the wind take the smoke from his hair. He did not indulge in sentimentalities. That was not his style. But he did allow himself one concession. He checked the broken radio. Its receiver clicked faintly, then died. Poole cheeked it like a man checking a pulse. Then he pushed the rag back over it and felt the small, sharp relief of having an anchor to the lesson he had learned. Prepare until preparation circles back as habit. At the scrub edge below the ridge, a runner caught him by the elbow. "Sir," she said, breathless and urgent, "HQ wants an update. They've picked up chatter. Tank elements to the east are moving. We think it's a counter that aims to encircle the ridge again by morning." Poole looked at the field, the men, the thin wound of tracks that marked how far they had come. He had bought a lane, but lanes could be blocked. The ledger demanded more entries. "All right," he said. "Tell HQ, hold as long as you can. Tell them we'll make a killing ground by the eastern fold. Send word to the Corps. We need artillery now and scouts forward. If they come at dawn, we'll be waiting. If they do not, we press their line until it bleeds." The runner departed, and Poole stayed, watching smoke and figures, the slow work of men trying to make a fortress of a day. He thought of the men who would not be part of tomorrow, and felt the ledger as an ache. Poole watched them work and thought of the ledger once more. Each log, each shovel of dirt,
Each nail set in a plank would be an entry that might yet tilt the sum towards survival. At mid-morning, a runner returned from Kors with the face of a man who had seen too much calculus and not enough mercy. "They'll launch in 3 waves," he said. "Main body will try to cut through the woodline north of the fold, while the second moves along the ravine to the south. They've learned to coordinate. Air support, none in the forecast." Poole only nodded. He had not expected the sky's help. He had expected men. He had expected the ledger to be unfair. He adjusted the rag on the broken radio as if it were a talisman, and sent a message to HQ confirming artillery fire and requesting smoke screens at the eastern approach. The reply came terse: "Hold, fire on sight, preserve." It was the language of commands that suspected heroism and wanted only obedience. He crouched with Haines near a shell crater and watched the eastern line through binoculars. Men moved like insects at first, clusters, detached anti-tank teams, and then took on form. Armored shapes that let off columns of dust. The guns answered, and for a while the valley spoke only in distant thuds and iron music. Poole felt a steady, cold satisfaction at the first sound of the enemy meeting designed obstacles, a chain of explosions, the knell of a knocked-out tank. But victory would not be wrapped in any single sound. It would be a ledger of patience, of men bled in small measures that added to large ones. When the first assault touched the eastern fold, it was in the low sun, and it took Poole's practiced calm to keep from flinching. Smoke rose, not all from the guns. Some was from burnt rubber and the little fires that set the grass aflame. They funneled the enemy where Lifford's men wanted them, and artillery, once zeroed, was merciless. Shells found gaps between armor like a needle separating thread. In the confusion, a second wave tried a sweep through the ravine, and Poole had anticipated that too. He launched a counter that was more trap than charge. 2 tanks pushing through a narrow corridor to meet them head-on, while flanking guns tore at exposed sides. The cost showed itself in immediate ways. Haines's left-hand gunner, young Finch, took a splinter to the shoulder from a ricochet. Finch grinned through the pain and kept the gun moving until Poole ordered him to the medic. A tank on the slope caught fire spectacularly, its turret a craned head of flame. Men shouted and dragged out a driver who coughed like he had swallowed ash and said nothing at all. A medic knelt in the dirt and cleansed a wound with the gentle economy of someone who had learned to do much with little. At one point, Poole saw a German commander, a figure standing on a mound near their blackened flag, trying to steady his men, waving a field glass and a pistol.
Poole marked him not from hatred, but from the clarity of a number on the ledger. There, another mind with duty. He wanted to take the man alive to answer questions, but opportunity and mercy are rare calculations in war. Instead, Poole directed the mortar teams to a spot just beyond the mound. The mortar fired with a violent arithmetic. The man toppled as if his balance had been recalculated and found wanting. The middle hour of the fight felt like a long compression of events. Poole moved from position to position, issuing orders with small, exact words. He judged ranges by the way dust rose and how men moved. He judged morale by the angle of a shoulder. When a reserve tank stalled trying to cross the eastern ditch, he sent 2 men and a rope and watched them heave. The tank gave a sound like an old animal and slipped free. Small victories stacked until they steadied a mood. And yet, the ledger is not only bronze and paper, it is also the tally in the mind. Poole found moments to count the men personally. Who had swallowed their fear and kept it hidden? Who had steady hands? Who had shrunk into themselves? The ledger took names and moral weights with the same hand. He thought of the driver pulled from the burning hull and whether he would ever speak again. He thought also of the rag and how a simple cloth could be the image of a wider discipline. Around noon, the enemy changed tactics. Their formations tightened. They brought a heavier gun to bear from beyond the ridge's sightline, a weighty presence that began to carve the horizon with smarter shells. The artillery noise shifted, longer arcs, deeper booms. Lifford reported that their rear strings had been cut in one place. A supply convoy had been hit, and munitions were running leaner than Poole liked to admit. He ordered a rationing of shells and a stricter selection of targets. No wasting of effort on what could not be physically stopped. It was the arithmetic of scarcity. 2 hours later, as a low, grinding sun sank, the enemy mounted what both sides would later remember as the true test. Their reserve, battered but coherent, swung in a slow, dangerous wheel to the east with the explicit aim of encirclement. The field changed from a line to a net. Poole felt the shift in his spine. He convened his lieutenants in a hasty map conference under canvas. A simple thing, with a rough map and pins and hands that moved with practiced ease. "We hold the eastern fold at all costs," Poole said. "We cannot allow them to close the lane. If they encircle us, we die by inches. If we can keep our lane open until nightfall, we might be able to withdraw in orderly fashion, with a skeleton left to hold ground." His voice was low. His words were ledger entries. "Use the last of our artillery on their center when they cluster. We'll draw them in, then hammer with everything we have left. If a flank opens, exploit it immediately. Haines, prepare a counter-push on my mark." "Lifford, stretch your smoke to the north. Watch for attempts to ford the stream. No men on suicidal runs. Save them for the shot that saves the rest." They moved like a single organism, but with different hearts. Orders traveled in shorthand, nods, hand gestures, the tight-spoken commands of a force used to speaking little and doing much. Poole returned to his turret and felt for the first time that day the full weight of possibility. The ledger could still balance. It could also tilt catastrophically. He found the rag again and put it to his mouth for no reason that had anything to do with hygiene. The rag smelled faintly of oil and sweat and the dust of 100 hands. He was a man leaning into habit. Night would come soon. But before that final pencil mark could be set, there was a new noise on the ridge. Not artillery alone now, but the staccato of machine guns and the freighted creak of tracked armor sliding into new positions. The enemy was close enough that individual voices rose and fell like waves. Poole peered through his sight, focusing until the world simplified to silhouettes and the mathematics of threat and aim. He gave the sign. Haines's men surged. The salvo the artillery had been saving struck the enemy center with the kind of precision that comes from long practice and grim luck. For a harvest of minutes, everything aligned. Tracks stalled, smoke lifted in curtains, men yelled, men fell. One of Poole's own tanks took a direct hit near the turret ring. The loader, a man named Pole, was thrown and lay very still. Poole felt a line go taut inside his chest.
He sent a runner to fetch the medic and simultaneously ordered Finch back into the line despite the splinter wound. "Not yet," he said, and Finch's jaw set. He did not argue. He had been measured in the ledger of courage before. The battle in that hour was brutal and precise, like arithmetic taken to its ugliest perfection. Poole found himself oddly thinking not of trophies or triumph, but of small things to be done right. That a wounded man must be moved gently to the shade. That the burning tank's crew deserved a burial wrapped, if possible, in a cloth that carried a name. These things were minor rituals that did not keep a ridge. They kept the men whole enough to continue. Then, as the sky shifted and the sun slid toward the lip of the horizon, a new sound threaded through the field. A high, distant scream, followed by a thudding that all at once sounded like a fall of many feet. When the smoke cleared, the eastern approach that had been the main artery of the enemy's maneuver had been cut by a fresh, unexpected obstacle. An overturned supply truck lodged across a narrow causeway, ignited and sending a black plume that obscured sight. Someone in the enemy line had made a daring, clumsy move. Whether by design or accident, it blessed Poole with a breathing space. He understands that luck tastes like smoke and looks like broken wood.
Guia de estilo e instruções para síntese de fala. Você é narrador, palestrante, com voz potente, forte e autoritária. O tom deve ser firme e inabalável. A frase anterior era: Clock tastes like smoke and looks like broken wood. Esta é a conclusão. Aumente a emoção para o nível máximo, mantendo a potência e termine com uma pausa solene e impactante. He understood that for every blessing of chance there would be other deaths. He also understood that the ledger, patient and indifferent, was still being written. He looked to his lieutenants, to his men, to the field itself. There were decisions to be made in the thinning light that would determine whether they kept their lane or become another note in some farther ledger. Poole set his jaw, felt the rag between his fingers, and prepared to make one more calculation, one that might cost him dearly, but that might keep the man waking in the mornings ahead. He rose from the turret as the last light bled and shouted the order that would compress the day into outcome. A counter-thrust through the smoke aimed at the enemy's exposed flank. Men answered with a single rough sound. Engines coughed and meant to go. The ridge inhaled. Beyond them, the evening held its breath, waiting to see which way the numbers would lean.